Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and this is my review of episode 5 of season 3 of Star Trek Picard, called Imposters. This time they did explain a few things which I complained about previously, so that's a good thing, even though there was one thing that they did the opposite. Worf cutting off that Ferengi's head, and I said, why don't you interrogate him first at least to get the information from him? But later it was implied that Worf knew everything he knew, so he didn't need to interrogate him. But suddenly in this episode they do say, oh, you could have interrogated him for that information, so it's too bad you cut off his head. So that's what I was saying. So I guess it was done deliberately as a joke, but it still annoys me because it makes Worf into an idiot. And again they reuse the 10 forward bar set again, and all kinds of things that make it feel cheap. Now I realize that in the old shows they did stuff like that all the time. Whenever they show us the surface of some alien planet, they would often reuse the same shot, the exact same matte painting as a different alien planet from a different episode, hoping we would not notice. So I realized that was done before, but with today's special effects, you would think it would be easier to show us a bigger variety of alien planets and not just have to revisit the same exact spot on the same planet and then tell us that criminals from all over the galaxy are all hanging out in this exact corner on this exact planet that they keep visiting, which is called Matalas Prime, after the name of the showrunner for some reason. So things like that kind of annoyed me visually, and the story itself has a bunch of problems. So anyway, the episode begins with Jack Crusher again having visions of seeing some red vines growing everywhere and hearing a voice calling for him to connect with her, to come back home to her. Some female entity is calling him, and I'll make a whole separate video just about all the theories of what that might be. Is it an anaphasic life form? Is it a Wraith? Is it the female caretaker from Voyager? There are a lot of possibilities. I will leave all of that for a separate video because it might be very long, and also discussing who the main villain might be, because remember, it's probably not a changeling, even though it appeared in the form of the changeling's hand floating in the air, but he kind of threatened her and told her something about your people, so obviously he's not really one of them. So I'll make a theory video on who that entity might be. It's going to be really funny because I'm going to throw every little silly idea I have in my head as well, and so I'm going to explore every possible option. So it's going to be a long video which I will keep for later. So Jack is having these visions and also sees himself as if he's in a Starfleet uniform and shooting all the bridge crew and killing people, and he has this kind of vision a few times in the episode. And we see that the Titan is being repaired by those small drones from way back in season 2 of Discovery. They don't show a close-up of them this time, they only show them from a distance, but we can hear the same kind of noises, and so obviously these are supposed to be the same kind of robots which are repairing the ships, which I don't really have a problem with it, especially since this show is taking place after all the other ones. So it's not really a problem anymore, but Riker says that they're back in Federation space on the edge of the Alpha Quadrant, and that really annoyed me because what does that mean? Were they outside of the quadrant in the previous episode? How did they get all the way out of the quadrant in one day? I guess they mean the Beta Quadrant, since the Federation is on the edge of that quadrant anyway, but then why does he mention it as if it's some big distance away? And so all kinds of lines like that annoy me when it's obvious the writers don't really get all these kinds of details. And we see Worf training Rafi, and they fight each other with swords and stuff, and I like how he keeps calling her Rafaela by her full name. And ever since season 1, I remember thinking, Rafi should have been a Klingon character right from the start. That would have explained her attitude, why she's so angry all the time, why she's not behaving like an evolved human. And pairing her with Worf was kind of a good idea because of that similarity that they have. And Worf tries to contact his handler because he's also working for someone who we don't know who that is yet, and he's denied the permission to go and investigate what was stolen in the Daystrom station, except of that portal weapon, which they assumed for some reason was just a distraction, that something else must have been stolen, and so they want to go there but are denied permission and have to find another way. And then we have the scene of Rafaela berating him for killing Sneed, that he says that, Sneed could have told us how they broke into that station, even though wasn't it Changelings who did it, so obviously it would be easier for Changelings to break into places and infiltrate places. That is what they do best, and so what's the big deal about those criminals apparently doing it for the Changelings? So it doesn't really make much sense. Especially if, later in the episode they say the changelings have infiltrated the highest levels of Starfleet and stuff like that. So if some top brass admiral simply wanted to take something from Daystrom, he could have done it officially without having to break in. So anyway, nothing makes sense. So anyway, they want to now interrogate the criminals to find out how they broke into that station. And then Rafaela tells Worf, too bad you beheaded Sneed, who could have told it to us. Now they have to find someone else who was a friend of Sneed. So that's when I kind of facepalmed, because that's what I was saying. Why did you kill him? Could have just cut off his hand and interrogated him for information, but you wanted to show off your sword skills, I guess. And now they're looking for some other associates of Sneed to get the same information they could have got from Sneed. And we have a list of names on the computer. A lot of them are recognizable, like Morn and Brandt from Deep Space Nine and Okana from TNG. All of them are known associates of Sneed, and one of them is a new Vulcan character who is a Vulcan gangster who is laughing and smiling and yet wears the Vulcan symbol, indicating that he does follow their ideology, even though he behaves nothing like a Vulcan. And it reminds me, even early in this season, I didn't mention it, but there were scenes of crew members on the Titan kind of hugging each other and stuff like that, and many of them were Vulcans. And I kind of ignored it because it was something small in the background, but now I remember, the new Trek shows don't really get what Vulcans are about. Remember the Vulcan suicide bombers from Star Trek Discovery and the crazy Vulcan cult from the first season of Picard, and so constantly they're ruining the Vulcans. Vulcans became like a joke of themselves, like they're a parody. Like this gangster guy keeps saying things like fascinating and calculating the odds of who will kill who in his improvised knife fight and all that kind of stuff. So he's behaving in a completely non-Vulcan way and yet pretending to be a Vulcan. So it's really silly in a very strange way and not in a funny way. So it's not funny to me. It's kind of annoying that they get all of this so wrong. I'm not against the idea that some Vulcan grew up away from the Vulcan culture and therefore not behaving like a Vulcan. I will be fine with that, but yet he's wearing Vulcan symbols at the same time, so make up your mind. It's like Michael Burnham grew up on Vulcan and yet cannot control her emotions and keeps crying in every episode. So illogical things like that, like make up your mind on who the character is. Don't make him a Vulcan who speaks in a Vulcan manner and yet is a gangster who wants to watch people kill each other. It doesn't make sense. Anyway, back on the Titan, we see the USS Intrepid is arriving to assist the Titan, and they're sending someone over to interrogate Picard and Riker for basically commandeering the Titan on their private mission. And Riker gives command back to Captain Shaw, who is again behaving in an obnoxious way and all of that. And he is a fun character and I enjoy the actor and all of that, but still he's behaving in a very non-Starfleet way. So he's happy they're going to get their asses handed to them by Starfleet. And then Riker kind of looks at him and says, we saved the galaxy a few times. And then he replies that, oh, but you also crashed the Enterprise D saucer section. And looks at Picard and says, and one of you broke the Prime Directive to get laid with a Baku villager in Insurrection, even though it wasn't technically a Prime Directive violation because those people actually had warp technology, so the Prime Directive doesn't apply. And then he says that they also created a time paradox in the Devron system, and that line annoys me because, first of all, how does he even know about it? In the end of that episode, All Good Things, all of those events didn't actually happen. Only Picard remembered any of that stuff happening because it was all in a different timeline. So none of that stuff in the Devron system actually happened in the end. And Picard only told his bridge crew, presumably. I guess he could have filed a report to Starfleet, and maybe they told all the other captains about it. But then how come in Season 4 of Discovery that Admiral said that the Q never created any such anomaly when talking about that gravity anomaly in Season 4 of Discovery, and he brought up all kinds of powerful species who could have done it, and then specifically said that the Q could not have done it because they never did any such thing before ever. And so obviously he didn't know about the Devron system incident, even though he's the head of Starfleet, and so that implies that Picard never told anyone else except his friends about that alternate timeline, and yet somehow Shaw knows about it here, and so it doesn't really make any sense if all of these shows are in the same timeline. We can say maybe each show is in a slightly separate timeline in which things happen differently, and that's why they don't seem to remember each other's history, but it's still kind of annoying. And then Picard meets Beverly in the corridor and she asks for his permission to do an autopsy on the changeling body, and he gives her permission to do it. And I'm thinking, wait, you just gave back command to Captain Shaw, so shouldn't she be asking him for permission and not you? And yet, I guess she doesn't know that Captain Shaw is in charge again, but Picard knows, and so he's not caring about it, or he's senile, or what. So that's also kind of funny. We then see Beverly is examining the remains of the shapeshifter whom they killed in the previous episode, and remember I complained about the fact that changelings are supposed to revert into liquid and turn into ashes when they die, and yet for some reason the shapeshifter who imitated Ensign LaForge stays in the shape of her body even after it dies for some reason, and here they acknowledge it and explain it, so I was very happy about that, because that shows me that was not a mistake, it was deliberate, and now they are explaining it. There are a few small issues, like Crusher says that changelings revert to liquid when they die, but technically they should turn into ashes. We saw that a few times in DS9, but at least they acknowledge the fact that they do not stay in the shape of the last person they were imitating. And then she cuts into the skin of the changeling and it starts bleeding, and she says it doesn't have any DNA, but it has blood, so it could pass a traditional blood test, and that also kind of annoys me a little bit because, changelings did have a way to cheat blood tests even in Deep Space Nine. Remember when Dr. Bashir was doing blood tests and then it turns out he himself was a shapeshifter and the vial he was holding was just part of his body, and so he framed someone else for being a shapeshifter. And Odo could make it look as if he's drinking a liquid from a cup when that liquid was actually part of himself, and it was implied that changelings can simply suck the blood out of someone and keep it inside their own body and take it out on cue whenever someone was testing them, so they could have cheated blood tests anyway. And also, if she says the blood has no traces of any DNA, then that means you should simply not just take blood to see if there's blood, but simply scan it for DNA, and then you'll know if it's real blood or not real blood, or even compare the DNA to the person the changeling is supposed to be imitating. I guess if he drained the blood of the same person, then it would be a match, but if he took some random person's blood, then it wouldn't be a match. And so there is nothing really new and shocking about this revelation that changelings can supposedly cheat blood tests now. That was something they could have done even back in Deep Space Nine. And then they also say that back then changelings could not imitate the internal organs, only the exterior of the body, which also makes no sense because, people could scan changelings with a tricorder and not detect that it's a changeling. Oda specifically said that if you scan the changeling, you will detect whatever the changeling is pretending to be, you will not be able to tell the difference. And there were scenes of people scanning changelings with a tricorder and not realizing it as changeling. So that was never the case, that they could not imitate internal organs. And Starfleet tricorders could always scan inside a person and seeing, if he's injured and stuff like that. So obviously they can detect organs inside the body, but maybe they simply mean that they could not mimic it perfectly. That with a better scanner you can realize it's fake inside. And so 7 directly mentions that after the Dominion War, every officer was required to go through an internal imaging chamber before reporting to duty, something like that. So that means they simply developed some better scanner that can detect changelings, and I'm okay with that idea. So even though the dialogue is slightly flawed in my opinion, at least they are explaining away the obvious contradictions that we had earlier, and that's something I was complaining about. Even Vadik smoking makes no sense if she's a changeling, but if now we know that she has actual lungs that work, now it kind of makes sense, and maybe that's why she had to physically cut off her hand with a knife and couldn't simply disconnect it at will, because these new changelings maybe are less liquidy and more meaty because of this new extra feature they have of being able to replicate the internal organs, and so maybe that is better for their infiltration because they're harder to detect, but they also lose some of their agility. They're not as quick and light and mobile as they were in Deep Space Nine, so they have an advantage and a disadvantage. So if they explain it that way, I'll be totally fine with it. And all of this brings back a theory I had many years ago. I don't remember if I ever talked about it in a video, but I remember theorizing that maybe the reason that the Founders turned Odo into a solid for a while was basically as a test for their advanced infiltration which they were planning, because maybe they knew that Changeling can always be detected by all kinds of ways, and the only way to make a true lasting infiltration is by fully turning a changeling into the person that he's imitating. So maybe no other changeling wanted to volunteer for this, and so because they wanted to punish Odo anyway, so they used him as the first experiment to turn him into a full solid for a few months, and then later maybe they are the ones who organized that small changeling baby to link with him, which turned him into a shapeshifter again, and so maybe it was all organized by them as kind of a test for a future plan to better infiltrate the Alpha Quadrant by sending in changelings who will become their targets for many months without any ability to detect them. So maybe Odo was simply the first test for such a deeper infiltration, and maybe we're seeing this new generation of changelings is kind of an upgrade to better infiltrate the humanoids without being easily detected, even though it might have the side effect of losing some of their other abilities. They don't seem to be turning into objects in this show, they don't seem to be able to turn into birds, and their speed and agility seems to be much lower compared to how it was in Deep Space Nine. So maybe it was kind of a deliberate modification they did to be able to infiltrate better at the cost of some of their other abilities. And it's also interesting that the first changeling we saw on the show was the transporter chief of the Titan. So maybe it's not a coincidence that he's in charge of the transporters, because maybe a transporter is another way to detect changelings. And so maybe that's why they're first replacing all the transporter chiefs, to make sure no one will use the transporter to detect the changelings, because they will hack all the systems to make it look as if everything is normal. Maybe they're also using the transporter to replace the people they want with shapeshifters. And also it kind of ties to one of Jack's visions, because in one of them, and when he sees himself killing Starfleet officers, he's also seeing that when they use the transporters, they turn into kind of a pile of tentacles, and so maybe he's seeing the fact the changelings are using the transporters to replace people with more changelings, and so I guess all of this will get explained later on. So anyway, they meet up with the USS Intrepid, which has a deflector dish on the back of it for some reason, and it's a much bigger and scarier ship, and they're sending over a shuttle to the Titan, and that immediately raises some eyebrows. Why are they not using the transporter? And so to me it kind of confirms that these must be shapeshifters who are coming over, and they don't want to use a transporter because a transporter would be able to detect that it's a shapeshifter and not a human, and that's why they're coming by shuttle. So how come the bridge crew doesn't get it? That might be the reason, and at least Picard is kind of suspicious, and he immediately asks Seven for a favor to hide Jack better on the ship. And so she goes to meet Jack and gives him a Starfleet uniform, which he doesn't want to wear because it's just like in his visions when he's killing people. So he doesn't want it to come true, I guess, and so he doesn't want to dress up like that. But then she tells him that the best way to hide is to be in plain sight, so he's dressed as a Starfleet officer now, just like in his visions. And then we see the person who came on that shuttle, and that is Commander Ro Laren, which is a pleasant surprise. It's always nice that they tie up loose ends from the previous shows, but I do have a few problems with this character. First of all, her nose ridges are barely visible, even in the close-up shots you can barely tell she's Bajoran, and Picard is super angry at her, even though it's been 30 years since she betrayed him. So that's the same problem I had with other scenes in the show, that people kind of overreact. And if this show was made earlier, a decade or two before, maybe it could make sense, but when 30 years have passed, would people really be that angry about events from so long ago? And also Picard is so surprised to find out she's back in Starfleet, and he never knew about it until now. I guess maybe it's because she was in Starfleet Intelligence, and so maybe it was classified, and even though he's an admiral, he didn't know about it. And so he's very pissed off, and even Riker tries to calm him down and says that was 30 years ago, and the Maquis are no longer an enemy. And that line kind of annoys me, because in Deep Space Nine they said that the Dominion wiped out all the Maquis, that maybe there are some remnants, but basically there are no Maquis anymore, and yet now they do still exist. And it was also a missed opportunity, because they could have used that for Ro's motivation, because later in the episode they revealed that she's actually Worf's handler. She's the one who did most of the work of the investigation against the changelings and all of that. And so if they said that she hates the changelings because of what they did to the Maquis, because they gave the order to the Dominion to wipe out all the Maquis, maybe that's why she's so angry, and that's why she dedicated herself and was so paranoid against the changelings and all of that. So that could have made sense, and yet they never mention it, and they only say that the Maquis are no longer an enemy. So anyway, Ro is there to investigate them before their court-martial, and Riker tries to be friendly with her, and he tells her, but you know us. And I kind of thought to myself, he means biblically, since he does know her quite well. And yet she remains strict and bossy, and wants to talk with Picard alone. And then Picard suspects that she might be a changeling because, she came on a shuttle and not a transporter, and she's not wearing her Bajoran earring, and so he becomes suspicious of her. Even though, why would a changeling pretend to be Ro Laren, whom he haven't seen for 30 years, who would only piss him off? It doesn't really make much sense, and obviously it wouldn't be interesting for the episode if it wasn't really her, so I didn't buy it for a second that she might be a changeling. And then she wants to prove to Picard that she's not a changeling, so she takes out a knife and does a little cut on her hand to show that she has blood. But the blood is not even dripping on the table, so if it's not separating from her body, it doesn't prove anything at all. Like, you have to let it drip to separate from you. If it's not separated, it doesn't prove you're not a changeling. Even Odo, as I said, could drink himself from a cup, and the fake Bashir changeling could pretend to fake someone else's blood test by turning some of the blood in the vial into liquid because the whole vial was part of its body. So unless the blood actually leaves her body, and then he comes over to it to scan its DNA to see that it's really Ro Laren's, and even then, maybe it simply drained the blood of the real Ro Laren, and so even then it wouldn't really prove anything. And just in the scene, Beverly also contacts Picard to secretly tell him that blood tests are no longer reliable, but they were not reliable anyway. And then she tells Picard, let's step into the holodeck, and I guess it's to avoid the surveillance systems of the ship. I guess maybe surveillance is not allowed inside the holodeck because people probably use it for God knows what, and you wouldn't want cameras in there, and so that's why a holodeck is a safe place to talk secretly. And they go into the holodeck, and it's again the 10 forward bar from before, and so that immediately annoys me because they're being cheap again. And then Picard pretends to go to pick up some drinks, and then we see a small screen of the simulation, and with one push of a button, he disables the security protocols. And that also really annoyed me, because why is it so easy to disable it? I remember an episode in TNG when Data wanted to turn off the security settings, and even he couldn't do it by himself. Even though he's the third in command of the ship, he needed Geordi to help him to give another authorization so that the holodeck will turn off the safeties. And yet now we can do it with the push of a button. Even if someone accidentally pushes that button, the safeties will be off in the holodeck. And Picard does it because he wanted to pick up Guinan's phaser from the bar to point the phaser back at Ro. And also on that same screen we see that the simulation is of that bar from 2024, so the year in which season 2 was taking place. And that also makes no sense, because previously they showed that the simulation is of the same bar that we saw in the future, which we saw for real, which even contained a copy of Picard's bottle which he gave Guinan in the previous season, and now it has a copy of a phaser. It's exactly the same phaser as Ro is holding. So it's not something from the 21st century, and he says that's Guinan's gun, and that is kind of a nice reference to the fact that Guinan did always keep a gun in the bar. We even saw it in TNG, so that's cute, but it makes no sense. Why does it say 2024, and how does he turn off the safeties by pushing one button? And why doesn't he tell Ro that he did that? Because otherwise it's just a holographic gun that wouldn't do any damage. So now they're in a staring match and trying to figure out if they're lying or not about each other. And in the end they do lay down their weapons when they realize they're both real, they're not shapeshifters, and so there's a bigger threat, and so they're putting their differences aside to deal with the bigger threat. And she tells him that she found out that the changelings infiltrated the highest levels of Starfleet and all of that, and I'm really hoping that at some point they will show that beach admiral from season 1 and reveal that she was a changeling for years, and so that will explain that annoying scene in the first season. Maybe they can have like a cheesy line of Picard saying something like that to her, the way that she cursed at him, he will curse at her and then vaporize her, something like that will be funny, so I hope it happens. So then Ro says that she doesn't even trust the transporters on her own ship, and that's why she insisted to come on the shuttle. I guess that's the way the changelings swap people with copies of themselves. When they beam someone over, they simply materialize a shapeshifter in his place, and that's why they first replace all the transporter chips on every ship. And then she says when she tried to open an official investigation, she was blocked at every turn, that she even tried to go to the media, and even that didn't work somehow. And I keep thinking, if she dug so deeply, why didn't the changelings get rid of her a lot sooner? Why only now they're trying to do it in this episode? If she was causing them so much trouble. And also it's revealed that she's the one behind Worf's missions and Rafi's missions. She says she has two assets that she trusts for investigating whatever the changeling stole from Daystrom. And then we see that scene of Rafi and Worf going into that district again, to the same exact street corner, and Rafi shoots her phaser in the air to attract attention, to try to scare the people into giving up that gangster who was a friend of Sneed. And then Worf just sits down to meditate for some reason, and Rafi apparently replaced herself with a hologram wearing a holographic emitter, while she goes off to some building with a sniper rifle to protect Worf. And then that Vulcan gangster approaches them and realizes that she's wearing a transporter emitter and shoots the emitter. And I'm thinking, cannot the mobile emitter simply put a hologram over itself as not to be so obvious, so that it wouldn't be seen by anyone? So this whole entire plan makes absolutely no sense. Just as Rafi's plans before were ridiculous, now Worf is also being an idiot. So they come there with no protection, no backup to confront these gangsters, get surrounded by them. Rafi is captured, and so her hiding spot was useless, and they bring her back down. And the bad guys are aiming green lasers at them, which I think are the same guns we saw in season 2 of Picard when those assimilated soldiers were hunting them around Picard's house in France, and they were using those green lasers. I think those are the exact same weapons, so that's ridiculous. And then the Vulcan gangster gives them knives and wants them to fight each other because they want to place bets on who will win. And so they give them knives so that they will fight each other. And then Rafi and Worf do fight each other. And then Rafi stabs Worf in the belly, and Worf falls down and says it's a good day to die, and he dies. And so Rafi killed Worf, and the Vulcan says, fascinating, I was calculating that the odds will be 10 to 1 in his favor, and yet you ended up winning. And then he says the smell of Klingon blood is disgusting, and tells his men to drag the body away. And I keep thinking, why don't you make sure he's dead? You do have guns, right? You do have phasers. Why don't you just vaporize him on the ground? Simply as a precaution. Don't you know that Klingons have multiple organs and all of that stuff? You know, do you really think that Worf, the great legend warrior, was brought down by a small knife to the belly? And yet apparently that's what he thinks, because he smells a lot of blood, and so he's sure Worf is dead without checking. I guess maybe they did check. And so they drag him away, and then the gangster tries to recruit Rafi into working for him. He says he knows that she has the husband and the son and the granddaughter who are also conveniently on the same planet. And so he begins threatening her, and suddenly all of his men get stabbed from behind again, because Worf was just pretending to be dead, and once again is stabbing people from behind, and then grabs him and threatens to kill him as well. So all of this stuff was absolutely ridiculous. If the gangsters simply shot at them right away, they would have won. So both Rafi and Worf are total idiots. Their whole plan worked by pure miracle, because the gangsters are so stupid they didn't even bother to check if Worf is dead. Actually, I guess they did check, but Worf says now that he mastered the careless technique of lowering his heart rate to be undetectable, and that's why they thought he was dead, because he lowered his heart beating, which is a really cheesy, cliche old line which was used in so many other movies. But what is annoying me is that he says it's a careless technique. Why the hell would Careless want to pretend to be dead? Isn't that dishonorable? Isn't that like a cheap trick that a Klingon wouldn't even use? Like, Klingons want to face each other bravely, face to face, not stab each other from the back like Worf is doing again in this scene, as he did before when he killed Sneed. He showed up from behind, stabbing people from behind in a dishonorable way and cutting off everyone's head. Now he did it again, and he first had to pretend to play dead so that they wouldn't know that he did it. Anyway, this whole scene, in my opinion, is absolute trash, and it could have been done so much better. All he had to do was call a favor from Martok, telling him, can you please send me your elite soldiers to help me out? And so in that scene when they first surround Worf and Rafi, and Worf says, I assure you, we have the upper hand, Imagine just an elite group of Klingon soldiers decloaking around those gangsters, like maybe they have personal cloaking technology now, and simply show a whole group of Klingon warriors decloaking around the gangsters, and then the gangsters surrender. Like Worf can simply call a favor from the Chancellor of the Klingon Empire, and yet apparently he's working all alone with no backup from anyone, which makes no sense. And he only succeeds by pure luck and the stupidity of the villains. And so this Vulcan agrees to tell them everything, and he says the only way to break into Daystrom Station is to use this device that someone gave me to break into that system, and he gives them that device, and it's not even clear if they killed him after that or did they keep him alive. Wouldn't he tell the changelings about what happened if they did keep him alive? So I guess they killed him off screen after he gave them the device. So anyway, back on the Titan, Ro gives Picard her earring, which previously he complained she doesn't have, and apparently she does have it, and she gives it to him, and then takes her shuttle back to her own ship. And the officers with her are complaining because they were trying to find Jack Crusher and couldn't, because I guess the ship's internal sensors didn't work, and because he was wearing Starfleet uniform they couldn't find him. And she commands them back to the shuttle and takes the shuttle back to her own ship, and she told Picard that she will try to delay the other ship so that he can escape. And then the officers with her on the shuttle put a bomb on the shuttle and beam out back to the Titan, because obviously they are shapeshifters. They even show it to us to make sure everyone in the audience gets it. So suddenly they morph into different people. And then Picard comes to Captain Shaw to tell him that they have to escape, and Shaw doesn't believe him, thinking maybe he just wants to escape court-martial and that's why he wants to run away with the ship, and so he doesn't want to believe it. And then Ro contacts them on the screen and tells them about the bomb on the shuttle. And then she and Picard kind of have the emotional exchange and apologize to each other and all of that. And Ro wants to sacrifice herself to delay the other ship, so she takes the shuttle and flies it into the nacelle of the other ship so that they will be able to escape from it, because the other ship is run by changelings and they're being framed for attacking the other ship. And that kind of reminds me of Star Trek 6 when the Enterprise was framed for something they didn't do. And then Picard sits down and face palms. And it's funny how the facepalm looks exactly like the classic one, the one that became a meme of him on the Enterprise D facepalming, and so here it looks almost identical. So I'm pretty sure that was probably deliberate. And so he said that Ro is dead. And as for me, honestly, I didn't really feel anything. I was happy to see her back after all those years. I always enjoy when they bring back all the loose ends to tie them up. But how come in this show they always bring people back just to kill them off? Just like Hugh in season 1, whom they brought back only to kill him off. So that's the wrap up, that's the continuation of the character, to bring him back just to kill him off. At least here they kind of did something with Ro and Picard. At least they settled their differences, at least they kind of apologized to each other and all of that. So at least it was something, but I still felt it was kind of rushed. They should have kept her around for a while longer before killing her off, in my opinion. And it turns out the earring she gave to Picard contains all the information that she collected about the conspiracy of the changelings, and so at least she contributed something to the bigger story. At least she helped save the galaxy in the end or something. So her appearance is not just a member berry for no reason. So it's not as bad as Hugh in season 1, but it still felt kind of rushed and annoying in my opinion. And it looks like the other ship is angry and is about to attack them, and Captain Shaw agrees to run away basically, and so they escape. And I guess in the next episode they'll be chased around by the entire fleet as a fugitive ship. And right before they escaped, two other changelings beamed over to the Titan somehow, even though it happened after Shaw called for a red alert, and so shields should be up, and yet somehow two more changelings managed to beam onto the ship. And then they try to catch Jack Crusher, but then again he has that vision and his eyes turn red. He gets activated like Soji in season 1, I guess, and he somehow is able to kill all of them even though they are changelings. And he even kind of holds one of them in a headlock, and the changeling somehow is not able to morph out of that, and so he easily kills off 4 changelings all by himself with his bare hands. So I guess those visions he had earlier were somehow warning him and preparing him for this event. He even saw himself wearing the uniform in those visions and all of that. And then he again hears a voice calling for him, and I will make a long speculation video about all the possibilities of who that entity might be. I will discuss all of that later. And then Picard shows Riker the earring that Ro gave him, and Riker puts it into the computer, and then it sends a hologram showing them all the investigation that she was doing. And I like how this time when they show the hologram from the other side, it looks mirrored, and so it does look correct. Unlike in season 1 when they showed holograms on the table and it looked the same from both sides, and so that always annoyed me. So here when it's from the other side of the hologram, it does look mirrored correctly. And then they get a transmission and they answer it, and it's Worf. Apparently Worf always communicated with Ro through her earring, which I guess has a secret communication device that no one can detect, and that's how she was conducting all her business. Everything was inside her earring, which no one dared to confiscate, I guess, because it's a religious importance to her, and that's why she always had it. And so finally these two storylines connect with each other, and I'm guessing in the next episode they will probably go together to break into the Daystrom station, where they will encounter Lore and Moriarty and all of that fun stuff. So hopefully it will not be too stupid, and maybe we'll finally realize what the Changelings actually wanted, and what's the deal with Jack, and who is the main bad guy giving orders to the Changelings. I will make theory videos about all of this in my next video, so stay tuned for that, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.